Finally, Lu Yuqing drew to a halt in front of the ancestral hall at the center of the Taoist temple. Her brows furrowed slightly as her gaze roamed over the memorial tablets before her, and she was looking a little dazed. Right at this moment, a thunderous boom rang out in the sky, and she shuddered as she instantly snapped back to her senses, then hurriedly made her way out of the Taoist temple to look up into the sky. A streak of dazzling azure light was in the process of rising up from the sea of flames up above, and it transformed into a pillar of azure light that erupted straight into the heavens. Tremendous sword chi was emanating from the pillar of azure light, stirring the sea of fire up into a frenzy, and the lightning that was crashing down from above was also thrown into a state of disarray. Hanli's eyes immediately lit up upon seeing this, but before he had a chance to do anything, another resounding boom rang out as yet another pillar of azure light rose up from the sea of flames while releasing extremely formidable sword chi. One pillar of azure light rose up after another in rapid succession, and a total of 72 pillars of light had emerged in the blink of an eye, all of which were giving off terrifying sword chi fluctuations. The sea of fire was snuffed out with ease by this burst of collective sword chi, revealing the white stone altar inside. The dark clouds up above were also completely scattered by the enormous sword chi in the air, while gusts of ferocious wind swept forth in all directions. Hanli wore a calm expression as he made a hand seal, conjuring up his true extreme film to protect him. As soon as the film took shape, a wave of scorching heat instantly surged over him, causing the true extreme film to crackle and flash incessantly. However, Hanli remained as still as an immovable mountain within the formidable shockwaves, and his gaze remained focused intently on the altar in an unblinking fashion. The shockwaves were so powerful that all of the greenery on the mountain's summit down below was reduced to powder, and a thick layer of earth was also scraped up from the ground, producing an extremely flat area. The Taoist temple was also swept up in the shockwaves, and the restrictions around it had already been broken by Xianxia, so it wasn't going to take long before the temple was also razed to the ground. Right at this moment, Lu Yuqing summoned her azure feather fan before waving it vigorously through the air, releasing a gust of fierce azure wind that formed an azure tornado to encompass the entire Taoist temple. After traveling over such a long distance, the power of the shockwaves was already significantly diminished, but the azure tornado was still trembling incessantly. Lu Yuqing's face paled slightly as she bit through the tip of her tongue, then expelled a mouthful of blood onto the azure feather fan in her hand. The fan immediately began to radiate bright spiritual light, and all of its feathers spread open like the train of a peacock before detaching themselves from the handle of the fan and vanishing into the azure tornado in a flash. The tornado instantly swelled drastically in size while radiating bright azure light, and it became far more stable than before. The shockwaves quickly subsided, but the entire mountain continued to sway violently as countless rocks of different sizes came tumbling down in a catastrophic avalanche. Moments later, the azure tornado around the Taoist temple faded, and the temple remained completely unscathed. Lu Yuqing was panting slightly, but her expression was quite calm, and she quickly swallowed a pill before looking up into the sky. At this point, the sea of fire and cascade of lightning up above had already disappeared, and all that remained in the sky was the white altar. Above the altar was a radiant ball of azure light that was several 100 feet in size, and it resembled an azure sun. An ecstatic look appeared on Hanli's face upon seeing this, and he unconsciously took a step forward. Right at this moment, the azure sun exploded violently, sending rays of blinding azure light erupting in all directions. Every single ray of azure light was a peerlessly sharp streak of sword chi that howled through the air, and the white altar was instantly punched full of holes before shattering into countless pieces. The surrounding 8 pillars suffered the same fate, reduced to countless pieces of scrap metal. An alarmed look appeared on Hanli's face as he flew back in retreat, while sweeping a sleeve through the air, and his heavy water true axis instantly emerged before him, then released a thick, heavy water barrier to shield him. He was retreating very quickly, but he was still unable to outrun these rapid streaks of sword chi, and he was only able to get a small distance away before the streaks of sword chi struck his Nerbe's heavy water true axis. The axis instantly began to tremble violently as a string of metallic clangs rang out in rapid succession, and the black water barrier that it had released was quickly being worn down. A rumbling thunderclap erupted out of Hanli's body as he accelerated drastically in his retreat, flying back to several dozen kilometers away in the blink of an eye. As for the azure sword chi, all of it abruptly dissipated after reaching a certain distance away from the altar, much to Hanli's relief. After waiting for a moment to ensure that there would be no more sword chi coming after him, he swept a sleeve through the air to stow his heavy water true axis away. Meanwhile, the azure sun in the distance flashed a few times, and the azure light that was radiating rapidly dimmed before fading away altogether, revealing the 72 azure bamboo cloud swarm swords hovering in midair in a circle. Hanli's eyes immediately lit up as he flew over to the circle of azure swords. Following this latest refinement, the outward appearance of the azure bamboo cloud swarm swords hadn't changed much. They had become more translucent, and bursts of azure energy were just barely visible flowing inside. Enormous spiritual power fluctuations were emanating out of the flying swords, causing the nearby world's origin chi to shudder and tremble, and a massive spiritual power vortex had taken shape around them. Upon sensing Hanli's arrival, the 72 flying swords suddenly flew through the air in a blur, transforming into 72 streaks of azure light before vanishing into his dantian in the blink of an eye. Hanli was quite startled by this, but he could sense that the azure bamboo cloud swarm swords were merely hovering in his dantian in a still manner. With the flying swords inside his dantian, he was able to get an even clearer sense of the changes that had taken place within them. After absorbing such an immeasurable amount of sword essence, it was no exaggeration to say that the azure bamboo cloud swarm swords had been reborn anew. In their current form, just a single one of his azure bamboo cloud swarm swords contained far more spiritual power than any of his other immortal treasures, including even the heavy water true axis that he had painstakingly refined. However, due to the fact that this spiritual power came from the sword essence of countless different swords, it was a little chaotic and erratic. This was something that had happened once before after the azure bamboo cloud swarm swords had absorbed the sword essence from the thousand-edge spirit-gathering sword array last time, so Hanli wasn't concerned. Looking at the 72 swords in his dantian, he locked onto one of them with his spiritual sense before sweeping a sleeve through the air, and only after a few flashes of azure light did the flying sword appear before him. Hanli raised an eyebrow upon seeing this. It seemed that the flying swords had become more difficult to control, and they also felt heavier and more cumbersome. However, this was only to be expected, considering how much more powerful they had become, and it should be possible to resolve these issues following another bout of refinement. With that in mind, Hanli made a hand seal before pointing a finger forward, and a layer of azure light instantly appeared over the flying sword's surface. The sword then moved a few times before falling still again. Hanli's brows furrowed slightly upon seeing this, and he opened his mouth to release a burst of azure light that enveloped the flying sword in a flash. The azure light radiating from the flying sword became even brighter, and once again it moved a little before falling still. Hanli's expression darkened slightly upon seeing this, and he channeled all of the immortal spiritual power in his body, releasing 2 bursts of dense azure light out of the palms of his hands, both of which surged into the flying sword. At the same time, his spiritual sense also flooded into the flying sword, and the azure light radiating from the sword's surface instantly brightened even further. All of a sudden, the flying sword twisted around before shooting through the air like an azure spirit snake, while expanding drastically in size, swelling to over 1,000 feet in length as it radiated blinding azure sword light. The entire surrounding space began to tremble in the wake of the tremendous sword intent emanating from the giant sword, and all of the nearby world's origin key instantly converged toward it. The light radiating from the huge sword continued to grow brighter and brighter as it pierced back and forth through the clouds like an enormous azure dragon. The cloud in the sky surged and churned violently before rapidly dissipating to reveal the clear blue sky up above. Only then did a hint of relief appear on Han Li's face, and a look of elation surfaced in his eyes at the sight of the giant sword. The sword had become far more formidable than he anticipated, and it wasn't inferior in the slightest compared with the combined power of the entire set of 72 Azure Bamboo Cloud Swarm swords in their previous form. All of a sudden, he made a hand seal, and arcs of thick and radiant golden lightning instantly emerged over the giant azure sword. The arcs of lightning were flashing over the blade of the sword like a flight of prowling dragons, giving off a violent and primordial aura. In the blink of an eye, the giant azure sword had transformed into a golden lightning sword and was giving off a devastating aura of destruction. Han Li faltered slightly upon seeing these. The comparison between these arcs of golden lightning and his divine Devilbane lightning from before was no different from that between night and day. Not only had the lightning become at least several times more powerful, there also seemed to be some type of new, unidentifiable property about them. Han Li hesitated momentarily before making another hand seal, and the giant lightning sword in the sky instantly stopped in its tracks, before becoming even brighter. Immediately thereafter, it swept through the air as if it were being swung by an enormous invisible hand. A streak of gargantuan azure sword chi swept forth, and it was several kilometers wide with arcs of golden lightning surging over its surface, presenting an astonishing sight to behold. The azure sword chi erupted in all directions, tearing through the very space itself to create countless black spatial rifts, while also causing the surrounding space to warp and tremble violently. The streak of giant sword chi vanished into space in the blink of an eye, but the disturbance continued to rage on, and the entire secret area was beginning to tremble and sway. Only after a long time had passed were peace and quiet restored.